Condorcet's Last Days, a Forgotten Liberal Hero. March, 1794, Paris. The attic room on the Rue des Fossoyeurs measured perhaps 10 feet by 12. A narrow bed, a small table, a chair. One window, kept shuttered. Madame Vernet brought food when she could, climbing the stairs quietly after dark. Nicolas de Condorcet had been hiding here for nearly a year. Outside, the guillotine worked daily. Former colleagues, fellow reformers, suspected counter-revolutionaries. The blade made no distinctions. He knew his name was on a list. He knew what arrest meant. So he wrote. 2 documents, actually. One was a letter to his daughter Eliza, not yet 4 years old. The other was a history of human knowledge from primitive societies to the present, with projections of humanity's future. Both were messages in bottles, cast into a sea whose currents he could not predict. The letter began, "My dear daughter." The history began, "Man is born, has needs, and receives sensations." Between them lay a life worth understanding, not because Condorcet was uniquely heroic, but because the choices he made illuminate choices available to anyone who believes reason and rights matter more than power, the education of a mind. His mother dressed him in white until he was 8, having consecrated him to the Virgin Mary after his father's death. The Jesuits educated him, first at Reims, then Paris. He showed unusual aptitude for mathematics. At 22, his paper on integral calculus impressed D'Alembert, who became both mentor and surrogate father. D'Alembert brought him into the salons, those drawing rooms where philosophes gathered to test ideas against criticism, where wit mattered more than birth, where women like Julie de Lespinasse and Madame Helvetius demonstrated that reason recognized no sex. This last point wasn't theoretical for Condorcet. He had met intellectual women. He had watched them argue mathematics and philosophy with the era's best minds and hold their own. His future wife, Sophie de Grouchy, was brilliant in her own right. So when Eliza was born in April 1790, Condorcet didn't see a girl child to be sheltered and married off. He saw an equal in waiting. That summer, he published On the Admission of Women to the Rights of Citizenship. The rights of men stem exclusively from the fact that they are sentient beings, capable of acquiring moral ideas and of reasoning upon them. Since women have the same qualities, they necessarily have the same rights. His colleagues thought this went too far. Universal male suffrage was radical enough. Why alienate potential allies? Because either rights were universal or they were privileges, Condorcet said. Compromise on principle wasn't moderation, it was betrayal. He applied the same logic to slavery. In 1788, he joined the Society of the Friends of the Blacks. He condemned slavery as incompatible with human rights, even as he cautiously supported gradual emancipation. The arguments for delay were familiar: economic disruption, unready populations, political impossibility. Condorcet's answer was moral and mathematical. You couldn't be partially committed to human equality any more than you could be partially pregnant. Either enslavement was compatible with human rights or it wasn't. The evidence was clear. His mathematical training shaped his moral reasoning. Probability theory taught him to identify patterns in data. Political philosophy required identifying moral patterns the same way, not what was expedient, but what was logically consistent with first principles. This habit would define both documents he wrote in hiding. Revolution and its Discontents, July 14th, 1789. The Bastille fell. Condorcet welcomed the revolution. Here was the chance to implement Enlightenment principles in actual governance. Rights grounded in reason, authority derived from consent, universal education opening paths previously blocked by birth. He entered politics, elected to the Paris Commune of 1790, then the Legislative Assembly, appointed to the Constitutional Committee. He drafted education proposals, universal, free, coeducational. He advocated abolition of slavery in France's colonies. He pushed for women's citizenship. His wife Sophie hosted a salon where reformers gathered. Their daughter Eliza, born in the Revolution's second year, would grow up in a new France, or so they hoped. But revolution has its own momentum. Constitutional monarchy failed. The king fled, was captured, brought back. War came, Austria, Prussia, England arraying against revolutionary France. Internal enemies multiplied, real and imagined. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, demanded revolutionary justice. Suspected counter-revolutionaries went to the guillotine. The terror wasn't what they called it yet, but that's what it was. In January 1793, Louis XVI faced trial. The verdict was predetermined: guilt. The sentence was debated. Condorcet voted for guilt. He also voted against execution. He had opposed capital punishment before the Revolution. He opposed it during. He would oppose it after, if there was an after. Principle didn't change with political wins. This vote marked him. Then came the Constitution. The Jacobins drafted a new one, centralizing power in the Committee of Public Safety. Checks and balances were eliminated. Rights were curtailed. Revolutionary necessity, they said. Condorcet published a critique. This wasn't democracy. This was tyranny wearing revolutionary garb. The principles that justified revolt against monarchy justified revolt against this. On July 8, 1793, he was denounced before the convention. The charges: spreading alarm, conspiracy against the Republic. A warrant issued. He could have surrendered. He could have recanted. Many did. It bought some of them time. It bought none of them safety. He fled instead. The Attic Madame Vernet was a widow who lived on the Rue des Fossoyeurs, Street of the Gravediggers, and had an attic room accessed through a concealed door. She brought him there in March 1793. He would stay until March 1794, nearly a year in a room 10 by 12 feet, shutters closed, writing by candlelight. He wrote the letter to Eliza first, not a short note, a meditation on her education and moral independence. The letter assumed his death. It assumed Eliza would grow up without him. It assumed the values he held might be temporarily eclipsed, but would eventually prevail. It was instruction, farewell, and prophecy combined. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "Do not be afraid to think over your own mistakes. Question your reason, and listen above all to the natural goodness which you are certain to find at the bottom of your heart. For if you do not find it there, all this advice would be useless. My experience and my tenderness could do nothing for your happiness. The egoism from which I should like to protect you is not the constant tendency to be continually and exclusively absorbed in our own interests and to sacrifice to them the interests, rights, and happiness of others. That egoism is incompatible with any form of virtue and even with any honest feeling. It would be too much to bear if I felt it necessary to protect you from such a feeling. I am discussing the egoism which, in everyday life, makes us see everything in terms of our own health, our convenience, our tastes, and our well-being. An egoism which keeps us, in some sense, in the presence of ourselves, which feeds on the small sacrifices it imposes on others without feeling, and almost without knowing, their injustice. an egoism which finds whatever suits it natural and just, and whatever harms it unjust and bizarre, and which complains loudly about caprice and tyranny if someone else, in response, thinks a little about himself. This failing diminishes benevolence, and it harms and cools friendship. We become dissatisfied with others because their self-denial can never be sufficient. We become dissatisfied with ourselves because our vague, aimless mood develops into a constant, painful feeling which we no longer have the strength to escape. If you want to avoid this misfortune, ensure that the feelings of equality and justice become second nature to you. Expect and demand from others only a little less than you would do for them. If you make sacrifices for them, appreciate them for what they really cost you and not according to the idea that they are sacrifices. Seek compensation for them in your reason, which will assure you that they will be reciprocated, and in your heart, which will tell you that they do not need to be. You will find that life in society is more pleasant and, dare I say, more convenient if you live for others. Only then do you truly live for yourself. Then he started the sketch. What he wrote about progress. Outside, the terror raged. Daily, the carts rolled to the Place de la Révolution. Former colleagues, suspected aristocrats, insufficiently enthusiastic citizens, the blade made quick work. Inside, Condorcet wrote a history of human progress. Not progress as inevitable, not progress as linear. Progress as a pattern strong enough to project forward. Knowledge accumulates, reason spreads, rights once recognized cannot be permanently suppressed. He divided human history into 10 epochs: primitive societies, agricultural development, alphabetic writing, Greece, Rome, the Dark Ages, the Crusades, the invention of printing, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. Each epoch marked by intellectual advances that enabled political and social progress. Not always immediately, there were regressions, dark periods, times when knowledge retreated, but the overall trajectory was clear. The final section projected future progress. Universal education would spread literacy and rational thought. Poverty would decline as knowledge increased productivity. Women would achieve civic equality as prejudice yielded to evidence. War would diminish as enlightened nations recognized common interest. Lifespans would lengthen as medicine advanced. He wrote this while condemned, while friends went to the guillotine, while the revolution devoured its children. While reason seemed to have failed utterly in France, the sketch was either delusional or prophetic. Time would tell which. But Condorcet wasn't predicting French politics. He was tracking knowledge across centuries. France 1794 was one data point. The scientific method, mathematics, the printing press, the spread of literacy, these were trends spanning generations. The terror would end. The Jacobins would fall. The knowledge would remain. He wrote in the final section, "How consoling for the philosopher who laments the errors, the crimes, the injustices which still pollute the earth, and of which he is often the victim, is this view of the human race, emancipated from its shackles, released from the empire of fate, and from that of the enemies of its progress, advancing with a firm and sure step along the path of truth, virtue, and happiness. The philosopher who laments, who is often the victim. He wasn't writing about abstract philosophers. He was writing about himself in that attic, hearing the carts pass below. The consolation wasn't that he would survive. It was that the progress would continue, that Eliza would grow up in a world better than 1794, even if worse than 1789, that someone, someday, would read these words and recognize them as true. The end around March 25, 1794, Condorcet left his hiding place. Why remains uncertain. Perhaps food ran low. Perhaps Madame Vernet could no longer risk harboring him. Perhaps he simply couldn't endure confinement any longer. He was arrested within days near Clamart. The prison at Bourg-la-Reine, renamed Bourg-l'Égalité, Borough of Equality, in the Revolution's grim irony, held him for 2 days. On March 29th, guards found him dead in his cell. The official report said suicide by poison. No poison was found. Other accounts suggest heart failure, exhaustion, deprivation, despair. His body went to a common grave. No marker, no ceremony. The sketch survived. Madame Vernet had hidden the manuscript. It was published in 1795, after the Terror ended. This was after Robespierre went to the same guillotine he'd sent thousands to. The letter to Eliza survived. Sophie kept it. She never remarried. She translated Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments into French, adding her own philosophical commentary. She hosted a salon until her death in 1822. She raised Eliza according to Condorcet's instructions. Eliza learned mathematics, languages, philosophy. She married General Arthur O'Connor, an Irish revolutionary exiled in France. She never achieved the civic equality her father predicted. French women wouldn't vote until 1944. But she proved his point about women's intellectual capacity. She lived until 1859, 65 years after her father's death, long enough to see some of his predictions beginning to materialize. What remains, too? Documents written in an attic while waiting to die. One told a daughter how to think, how to learn, and how to be fully human, despite a society that would tell her women weren't capable of such things. The other told humanity that knowledge accumulates, that rights once recognized cannot be permanently suppressed, that reason would eventually prevail despite temporary setbacks like the Terror. Both documents assumed the writer's death. Both assumed that truth mattered more than survival. Both proved correct. Not immediately, not completely, but across time. Universal education spread, though slower than Condorcet hoped. Slavery was abolished in the French colonies in 1848, and then in the United States in 1865, though it persists in other forms today. Women gained suffrage, in France not until 1944, but earlier elsewhere. Poverty declined as knowledge increased productivity, though not as uniformly as he predicted. Lifespans lengthened. War didn't end, but became less casual, less accepted as natural state between nations. The progress wasn't inevitable. It required work. It required people choosing principle over expedience, reason over passion, universal rights over particular privileges. It required people like Condorcet, who voted against executing the king when voting for execution was safer, who advocated for women's rights when it alienated allies, who criticized revolutionary tyranny when silence would have been prudent. The Terror ended in July 1794, 4 months after Condorcet's death. Robespierre went to the guillotine. The Committee of Public Safety fell. France didn't become the enlightened republic Condorcet envisioned, not then. Napoleon came instead, then Restoration, then more revolutions. But the sketch remained. The letter to Eliza remained. The ideas remained. Condorcet's patriotism was never to the French government of 1794, or even to France as a nation. It was to the principles that justified France's revolt in 1789, liberty, equality, rights, grounded in reason rather than tradition. When the government betrayed those principles, His loyalty remained with the principles. This is what the attic room teaches. Patriotism means fidelity to principles, not power. When your country betrays its founding ideals, your duty is to the ideals, not the betrayal. His love for Eliza expressed itself not in trying to shield her from a harsh world, but in equipping her mind to navigate it. He didn't write, "Be careful, be modest, be acceptable to society." He wrote, "Prove them wrong. Use your mind. Resist constraints placed on you solely because you're female." This is what the letter teaches. Love means preparing people for reality, not pretending reality doesn't exist. It means giving them tools, not illusions. The sketch and the letter were the same project, really. Both said, the present moment doesn't define what's possible. Knowledge accumulated over generations matters more than the current government. Rights grounded in reason will outlast tyrannies grounded in force. Your daughter can reason, therefore she has rights, regardless of what current law says. Both documents were acts of faith, not religious faith, but faith that reason could identify patterns strong enough to project forward, that evidence could distinguish truth from wishful thinking, that human equality was a fact to be recognized rather than a privilege to be granted. Condorcet died in a prison cell, branded a traitor by the revolution he'd helped make. The reforms he advocated took generations to implement. He never saw his daughter grow up. He never knew whether his manuscripts would survive. But he wrote them anyway, and they did survive. And the progress he predicted did materialize, haltingly, incompletely, but unmistakably. The attic room on the Rue des Fossoyeurs is gone now. The street has a different name. But what Condorcet wrote there remains, not as museum pieces, but as active arguments about what humans owe each other, what parents owe children, what patriots owe principles. 2 documents, 1 man, 1 choice, to write truth while waiting to die, trusting that truth would outlast tyranny. He was right.